Again, the angel says to Mary, "Do not be afraid." Do not be afraid. Words spoken not just to her, but I hope in this season of Advent all of us feel like those are words that are spoken to us in the midst of any time, any circumstance, when we worry, when we doubt, when we're afraid. Now let me quickly say there are those times and circumstances. The angel doesn't say don't ever worry, don't ever doubt, don't ever have times when you're afraid. The angel instead acknowledges as though that is just given. That is what life seems to bring. I was struck recently by a song by the singer-songwriter Jason Isbell. Jason Isbell sings and writes in this song about the great fear that he and his wife have for their kindergarten-age daughter. With the daughter starting school, and daily there seems to be some story in the news about a school shooting or in some public place, he confesses it strikes fear into his heart. And to name it, he writes in one verse about an incident that happened when he and his daughter were at the grocery store, and suddenly there was a loud noise. It was just a balloon popping, but it struck fear into his heart. These are his words: balloon popping at the grocery store, my heart jumping in my chest. I look around for the exit door. Which way out of here's the best? The kids looking for the candy aisle. School's starting in a week. Lady says, "You have a lovely child." I'm too terrified to speak. And then his plea, can we keep her here at home instead? Can we teach her how to fight? Something changing inside my head. Something's drowning out the light. It probably isn't a parent, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle who doesn't know what he's singing about there. That's kind of the times we live in. It's the circumstances that I'm trying to describe here when I say the angel doesn't tell Mary or any of us that there won't be those moments in life. But the angel's message is, don't be afraid. Now, over these weeks of Advent, we are following a theme called generation to generation. We're looking at the generations that have unfolded ever since the prophets first spoke, until that time when those prophecies came to completion in the birth of Jesus at Bethlehem. But we're also remembering that ever since that birth, there have been generation after generation of faithful Christians that no matter how difficult the circumstances, no matter how dark the days, they've kept faith in the promise of that birth. Here at Calvary, we're remembering this year that this marks the 100th anniversary of the start of this church. We want to remember the men and women throughout these years who have faithfully made it possible for us to then continue their legacy here in this particular church. But certainly we could say those 100 years weren't easy. They didn't keep the faith just lightly, but rather for them there were no doubt those same kind of moments I'm trying to describe where they felt tested and challenged, and maybe their faith wavered because of the darkness of those particular days. Think about the last 100 years. There's been a Great Depression, a Great Recession, other economic ups and downs, whereby you imagine that there have been families who have wondered where the next meal is going to come from, or whether they're going to still have a roof over their heads or clothes on their back. You think about some of the other ordeals they've been through, a great world war, countless other conflicts and wars, Cold War, times when men and women had to leave to go to defend our country. And you think of those who stayed behind and the fear they had that Maybe they would never see their loved ones or friends again. Again, those have been the kinds of things that those faithful men and women over 100 years have had to endure. There have probably been all the other kinds of just personal things, of crises of confidence, or worries about their family or their children, or how are things going to go. Maybe there have been illnesses or setbacks at work. There have been all of those things, and yet somehow they persevered despite those kinds of circumstances. And it'd be wonderful then to get to this day, 100 years later, and to say that all of those difficulties, those dark days are in the past. But as Jason Isbell writes for us, we have our own set of random acts of violence that make no sense, of a world where it seems to be that our climate's out of control and there are bigger storms than ever and the temperatures keep rising. We have our own set of circumstances that can cause people to wonder and question and to doubt and to fear. And that's why we need the angel's message. And we need this season of Advent that reminds us that God meets us even in the midst of our fear. For Mary, of course, she was afraid because a divine being appeared suddenly before her. She was just a young woman. And suddenly one day out of nowhere, this angel appears and speaks to her. And no doubt she questioned, why in the world is this heavenly being right in front of me now? Why is this being here speaking to me? There was that kind of simple fright and shock at the sight of a heavenly being. And the angel, of course, wants to speak to that. The angel wants to assure Mary that she's found favor with God. But the angel's message then goes on to something much, much bigger than just Mary's plight. Because the angel goes on to speak about the plight of Mary's people, the people of Israel. Now, we can know that from the history of that time that the people of Israel then were in captivity. They were being occupied by the Romans. It was another in a long stream of times when their nation had gone through prosperity but also through difficulty. And now they were in one of those times of difficulty because the Romans were now their rulers. The Romans were those who were taxing them. But there's something deeper about the plight of her people than just the fact that they were now an occupied land. Because this was something that had played out again and again in their history, and it was almost as though they began to believe that maybe God was at an end with them, that they had failed God so many times that maybe God had given up. That was the setting for the appearance of that angel in front of Mary, and that's what the angel then speaks to, because the angel reminds Mary, but she's reminding her people that God hadn't forgotten them, that God was about to do a new thing, that yes, they had failed in the past, but no, God hadn't given up. God was about to send a ruler over Israel that would be unlike any other. It would be a new king whose kingdom would never end. That was Mary's message to Mary that she heard from the angel. And it's a message spoken to Mary's people and people ever since. For it's a message really about the faithfulness of God. That even when things seem bleakest, or even when things seem incredibly dark, we have a God who keeps God's promises. We have a God who is faithful, who never forgets any of us, even if we find ourselves in the worst circumstances. You know, just about a year ago, I came across an essay that was written by a man by the name of Esau Macaulay. Esau Macaulay is a professor of New Testament at Wheaton College, but he was writing about an experience that he had as a little boy at Christmas. And Esau Macaulay said it's very important kind of to have a background. He said, I grew up poor. I grew up in a project in the slums of Huntsville, Alabama. He said it was difficult circumstances. Our family, others like us, lived in a world in which we felt everybody else had forgotten us, except we ourselves. We were, as he puts it, we were alone, walking through a land of trauma. Nothing good ever seemed to happen. And he said that was usually the case at Christmas. Yes, he would always get something, but it was never the kind of wild dreams that children often have and that sometimes get met. He said that for several years he had dreamed and had seen somewhere a commercial for what was called a Power Wheels Jeep. And evidently this Power Wheels Jeep was big enough that young boys and girls could climb in it and actually drive it. And he wished like crazy that he could get a Power Wheels Jeep. He prayed about it. He wrote to Santa about it. But of course, Christmas came, Christmas went. There was never a Power Wheels Jeep, not for a boy in bleak circumstances in Huntsville, Alabama. Till he said there was one Christmas when suddenly, a few days before Christmas, his grandmother hit the numbers. His grandmother played that daily game. The little balls fell into place. And suddenly she won more money than she had seen in a long while. And his grandmother decided to buy all of her grandchildren the Christmas present that they wanted. And so when Christmas Day came, Esau Macaulay said there was outside waiting for him was a Power Wheels Jeep. Now he said this, in writing about this, you have to forgive him. He was just a little boy, and he was a boy born in the bleakest of circumstances. But he saw that Power Wheels Jeep as a sign of God's faithfulness. He said he had prayed about it. He had wanted that more than anything else. He never expected. To him, it was as great a miracle as you could imagine that he had it. And even though, I guess, he came to know that his grandmother had gotten it for him because she had been gambling, and even though he said actually a couple of months went by and he outgrew it and could no longer ride it, it didn't shake his faith in the promise of Christmas, because he had seen and felt, he said as a boy, that God doesn't give up on little boys in Huntsville, Alabama. And writing about this, he said that to him it became a sign. One little miracle that pointed towards a much larger one, but that spoke about God's faithfulness. And this is how he sums it up, and he writes, and let me read you his words. He says, Christmas is the grand miracle that makes space for all the smaller miracles that God's going to do. It gives us enough hope to walk a little further in the dark towards something that seems too distant to reach. I like those words. Christmas gives us hope that allows us to walk just a little further in the dark that sometimes seems too distant to reach. So, my word today is, where is there darkness in this world? Where is a darkness that just seems too far to reach? In the world, maybe it's wars that nobody wants, that nobody seems to be able to end. Maybe it's a planet that seems to be slowly being destroyed by the very people who need it to survive. Or maybe it's more personal. Maybe it's a problem in a relationship, or some difficulty in work or at school. Those distant, dark places. We should be a people, though, who take hope in the news that God didn't forget God's people long ago. God didn't forget because God reached out to Mary. We should remember that God doesn't forget little poor boys in Huntsville, Alabama. God doesn't forget you and me. That's part of the good news of this season. We have a God who meets us even in the darkest places. God meets us in our fear. Amen.